I'm Lindsay Brancher with the BBC World News. The headlines: Japan's Prime Minister apologizes for the suffering inflicted by his country during the Second World War. Russian President Boris Yeltsin warns Chechen rebels to surrender their weapons or face more military action. And Greenpeace activists are detained in China after a protest against nuclear tests. The 50th anniversary of the Japanese surrender at the end of the Second World War has been marked at ceremonies across Asia. The Japanese Prime Minister Tomoichi Moriyama, in a statement approved by the cabinet, spoke of his heartfelt apologies for the suffering caused by Japanese aggression during the war. And later at prayers in Tokyo, Emperor Akihito offered the hope that the tragedy resulting from the war would never be repeated.
At the Yasukuni Shrine this morning, Shinto prayers were offered for the spirits of Japan's 2 million war dead. Also commemorated at the nation's principal memorial to the war are known war criminals. It was a political occasion too. Many right-wing cabinet members openly came to pay their respects. Significantly, their party's 50th anniversary statement praised the spirits of their war heroes, but offered no apology to their opponents. At the same time, the Prime Minister, Mr. Murayama, speaking with cabinet approval and, as he said in the name of the Japanese people, called the country's war policy mistaken and said it amounted to aggression. Then he uttered the crucial words.
I express here once again my feelings of deep remorse and state my heartfelt apology. Allow me also to express my feelings of profound mourning for all victims, both at home and abroad.
Even that statement needed clarification. Was the Prime Minister speaking personally or on behalf of the whole cabinet?
This statement is called the Prime Minister's statement. But this statement was endorsed by the cabinet. This morning there was a cabinet meeting just before the conference where he made the statement. He got the authorization from the entire cabinet.
Later in the morning, the whole Japanese political establishment gathered for an official ceremony of remembrance. Emperor Akihito prayed for the souls of all those who died during the war. At today's official ceremony, neither Emperor nor Prime Minister used the word apology. For old soldiers and their supporters at the Yasukuni Shrine, the Prime Minister's words may well arouse mixed feelings. In Japanese eyes, how much of an advance do they represent?
For some people, these people think that the major or the sole responsibility of the war, these people think this is an advance. But there's many Japanese who think that Japan is not only Japan is responsible, but there's other elements and other countries are also responsible for the war. These people think, I think they think this is a retreat.
Deep in the hearts and minds of the Japanese people, this may only be the start of coming to terms with everyone's wartime pain.
John Chusa reporting there. Earlier we spoke to the Japanese Deputy Ambassador to London, Sadaki Nomata. He said that the Prime Minister's statement was an unequivocal apology, representing the sentiments of the whole Japanese government and people.
In a process of national soul searching, there emerges a trend, the thrust. And the thrust of the public opinion, a thrust of the sentiment on the part of the Japanese people is for us to acknowledge very forthrightly that great damage and pain were caused by our actions to so many people during the war. And that is precisely what the Prime Minister stated.
In his speech, Mr. Murayama said colonial rule had caused tremendous damage and suffering. Those years are being remembered throughout the region, and there has already been reaction to Japan's apology. The South Korean President Kim Jong-sam said he hoped Seoul and Tokyo could now put the past behind them. And in Australia, the Prime Minister Paul Keating described the apology as comprehensive and said most wartime opponents of Japan would be satisfied with it. Thousands of people have been taking part in ceremonies, parades and memorial services to commemorate the war dead.
Brisbane, Australia, one of the cities of strategic importance during the war, was the focus of the National Day of Commemoration. An estimated 75,000 people lined the streets and cheered from office windows, showering veterans with streamers and confetti as they marched with their families. In an address, Prime Minister Paul Keating paid tribute to those who gave their lives during the war. He described Japan's apology as comprehensive and said most wartime opponents of Japan would be satisfied with it. In South Korea, police clashed with thousands of students as they tried to make their way to hold a joint rally with their North Korean counterparts. The students, defying a government ban, were demonstrating for reunification with the North. The South Korean President, Kim Young-sam, also called for a unified state. Reacting to the Japanese apology, he said he hoped Seoul and Tokyo could now put the past behind them. He granted a sweeping amnesty, and Kim Sum-yong, a man described by Amnesty International as the world's longest-serving prisoner of conscience, walked free from prison. In North Korea, about 30,000 people took part in the national rally in the East Coast industrial city of Hamhung to mark the 50th anniversary. Vice President Pak Song-chol and other senior government officials attended the ceremony. Commander-in-Chief of North Korea's armed forces, Kim Jong-il, failed to appear. In China, the President and Communist Party chief, Yang Zemin, visited the site on the outskirts of Beijing, where Japan launched its 8-year military invasion from northern Manchuria. He strolled on the Marco Polo Bridge, where Japanese troops attacked Chinese forces in 1937. He said he hoped Japan would sincerely review its past to avoid any repetition in history. Melanie Ray, BBC News.
Germany has asked China to provide information on the arrest of 6 environmental activists following an anti-nuclear protest in the centre of Beijing. The German Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel said the protesters, some of them German, must be allowed immediate access to their embassies. The Chinese authorities have said only that the protesters are under investigation.
Greenpeace had planned its first ever demonstration in China with pinpoint accuracy. These pictures, taken by the Greenpeace group themselves, show the activists preparing in their hotel room. They said they wanted to draw attention to China's nuclear testing program. The activists were all senior members of Greenpeace, among them the German international director. With an eye for publicity, the activists chose China's most politically sensitive spot, the Gate of Heavenly Peace on Beijing's Tiananmen Square. It's the site of other demonstrations in China's modern history, some of which ended in bloodshed. But today, Tiananmen Square is permanently covered with a blanket of security. The unprecedented Greenpeace demonstration was predictably short-lived. Chinese police moved in immediately to stop it. The activists were detained. There are no more details of their detention. A police spokesman told the BBC only that the case was under investigation. Adam Brooks, BBC News, Beijing.
The Indian Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao has accused Pakistan of responsibility for the killing of a Norwegian hostage by a Kashmiri militant group. In a speech marking Indian Independence Day, he said Pakistan was continuing to arm Kashmiri separatists and had to take the blame for what had happened. Pakistan has rejected the accusation. The Pakistani Foreign Minister Asif Ahmed Ali described Mr. Narasimha Rao's remarks as baseless and highly irresponsible. The Kashmiri separatists' latest deadline for the release of jailed separatists expired today.
Independence Day in India, when the country remembers freedom from the British Empire. The Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao began his speech with some words about Kashmir, unfinished business from the partition of nearly half a century ago. He blamed Pakistan for the continued crisis on the Indian side of the disputed Kashmir border. He said the Norwegian hostage had died because of Pakistan's continued support for militancy here. The kidnappers have phoned the Indian authorities at least 3 times today to repeat their demands that their comrades should be released from Indian jails. But they've made no contact with the diplomats of the countries involved for 2 weeks, and the diplomats are urgently trying to re-establish contact with Al-Faran, the name given by the group holding the hostages. The confirmation from the post-mortem examination in Delhi that the Norwegian hostage Hans Christian Osterø was killed by having his head cut off has cast a shadow over those working for the release of the hostages. One Indian source said that if there is any dramatic news, then it will be bad news. The Al-Faran have been put under increased pressure by the call for a one-day general strike tomorrow made by a coalition of secessionist groups in Kashmir. One prominent leader of a pro-Pakistani party was phoned late at night and threatened by someone who claims to have come from the Al-Faran group. The hostage-taking has set Kashmiri against Kashmiri. David Loyne, BBC News, Srinagar.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin has threatened to use force against Chechen rebels unless they hand in their weapons. He's accused them of failing to implement a military agreement.
President Yeltsin's threat relates to an agreement which was signed last month by Russian and Chechen negotiators. Under the deal, the Chechens promised that they would start laying down their weapons while peace talks continued. But that hasn't happened, and President Yeltsin has now made it clear that he's losing patience. Today, he said that armed gangs in Chechnya were beginning to regroup and become active. He stressed that that could not be allowed to happen. And he gave a warning that Chechen leaders must come up with a satisfactory response by tonight. Diana Goodman, BBC, Moscow.
The latest diplomatic initiative in former Yugoslavia has suffered a setback. A delegation led by an American Assistant Secretary of State, Richard Holbrooke, has been forced to cancel a visit to the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, because of fog. Mr. Holbrooke is aiming to outline Washington's proposals for achieving peace in a series of meetings in Zagreb, Belgrade and Sarajevo.
Amid the complexities of military and diplomatic standoff in the former Yugoslavia, refugees in different areas are facing triumph and disaster at a bewildering rate. These jubilant Croatians, exiled from Knin by Serbs in 1991, are re-entering the city on their way home, enjoying the spoils of victory after the Serb defeat there last week. But over the border, in Serb-held parts of Bosnia, Serbs have been retaliating by stepping up their expulsion of Croats and Muslims, who've clung to their homes around Banja Luka through 3 years of intimidation. Several hundred boatloads of Croats from there have been arriving in the town of Davor, and the United Nations says it expects the remaining Muslims from Banja Luka to follow soon. In central Bosnia, the government army has placed severe restrictions on the movement of UN personnel as it continues its own offensive to secure key roads. The UN here says artillery duels have been intense since Saturday, although it's not been allowed to monitor the fighting. Meanwhile, on the coast in the town of Dubrovnik, people have been staying in shelters after another night of shelling by Bosnian Serbs. The Croatian army commander has visited there and warned of retaliatory action soon against nearby Bosnian Serb areas. Martin Lum, BBC News.
Among the many ceremonies held today to commemorate the end of the Second World War was one held at the River Kwai on the border between Thailand and Burma. 50 years ago, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war died when they were forced to build a railway through the jungle to connect Japanese bases in Thailand and Burma. Our correspondent Neil Bennett watched as veterans from both Japan and the Allied countries joined in remembering the war dead.
These days, the train has to ease its way through tourists as it crosses the bridge on the River Kwai. It carries mainly sightseers and commuters to and from Bangkok, 80 miles away. The original bridge, which the Japanese built to take munitions and supplies, was destroyed by Allied bombers in 1945. But that was far too prosaic an ending for the film which inspired the legend. The brutality towards prisoners of war depicted in the film was closer to reality. The Burma-Thailand Railway cost the lives of 16,000 POWs and 100,000 native labourers. In place of the makeshift graves, those who died are now commemorated in the war cemetery in the small town of Kanchanaburi, where a brief and simple ceremony was held. The lives of 2 British and 1 Japanese veteran looking on were changed forever by their wartime experience. The events being remembered here have created plenty of myths, but some of the things which have happened since are almost stranger than fiction. Takashi Nagase was an interpreter for the Japanese equivalent of the Gestapo and witnessed many acts of torture. He built his own temple at the River Kwai and returned many times as his own personal act of atonement.
I can't stand that horrible scene. So I swear myself to come again and pay homages to save my soul.
British POW Trevor Dakin emigrated to Canada after the war, but 9 years ago came to live near the River Kwai, the very scene of his suffering.
It was a ghost, and it laid it to rest. It's gone now, and I don't have any nightmares at all now. I was still having them before I came here, but they're gone now.
The request for Japanese visitors to stay away from the cemetery while local school children laid flowers reflected the bitterness still felt by many, but not all, of the Allied veterans.
When I first went home, I had hatred in my heart. It went slowly, and I hope that before they die, the others will feel the same way.
This was a day of commemoration for men who have found reconciliation with former enemies. Others haven't been able to cope with the past in the same way. Neil Bennett, BBC News, at the River Kwai in Thailand.
That's all from me for the moment. Stay with us for The World Today with Nikki Marks and Brian Hanrahan.